transition now to Kim Hurwitz. Kim is the CMO of FITE, which is the premier global platform for sports and entertainment. And as I was looking at this, I was thinking, this is like Steve Jobs meets Conor McGregor here. It's like the perfect intersection. She doesn't seem like a lady you want to mess with. So Kim, thanks for joining us. I will get out of your way and the time is yours.
Well, thanks so much, Kevin, really appreciate that. Actually, I'm a black belt in Shotokan karate. So, but you know, we learned how to fight so you don't have to fight, right? Because that's how you win, really. So I'm doing a presentation to y'all, thanks to Dylan. That was very inspirational. You're a smart guy for 25. So I think you have a bright future ahead of yourself. The changing face of combat sports, or let's see if I can, how I learned to stop worrying and embrace the change. Props if you know what movie line I was playing with there, but if not, that's okay too. So let me dive right in. I only have 20 minutes, so I am not going to give you a whole history of combat sports, but rather focus and make it more personal on my own 25 plus years of marketing combat sports. And I'll dive a little bit into the history here and there to kind of set the anchor the presentation. And going to focusing a bit on pay-per-view, which is really the bread and butter for combat sports, both in the past and currently. The concept of pay-per-view grew out of closed circuit boxing matches and was also called closed circuit theater. It was available in the 40s and the 50s, but grew in popularity in the mid 60s and into the 70s, especially with appearances by the greatest, Muhammad Ali. Closed circuit broadcasts were typically held in theaters or large rooms, even arenas, and you'd buy a ticket, you'd sit with a large crowd of people, and you'd all watch it on a huge, large TV screen. And these were events that were not available on regular television, so this is the only way to see them. And large venues, even like the Forum in Los Angeles that seats 18,000 people, they had closed circuit events there as well. So what is pay-per-view? It's a retail transactional purchase. It can be a movie, concert, Justin Bieber on concert, it could be boxing match or any other sport. The pay-per-view transaction favors a live event, typically, that's exciting, unpredictable. And boxing and pro wrestling, which also had matches on the closed circuit theater, they have a built-in audience of people who are ready to pay to see something that happens live. All right, so you may ask, well, what are combat sports? I mean, how did that all begin? Well, I'm glad you asked. Combat sports date back to the ancient Olympics, where they had contests that combined boxing and street fighting and wrestling. It's called pancration, which was also used in the Greek armies. And Roman tournaments of this type were common, and they often fought to the death. So that's a commitment. They would often use padded gloves for practice, but in the actual event, they would use thinner gloves. They're called a cestus, and they often had metal and spikes woven in it. Eventually, with the rise of Christianity and the fall of the Roman Empire, pugilism, which is the profession of boxing, ceased to exist for centuries. Now, for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on boxing and mixed martial arts, as those are the sanctioned combat sports. Otherwise, we'd be here for an hour or two. In 1698, brief history about boxing. In the UK, regular contests of bare knuckle boxing with some wrestling thrown in were very common. You could knock your opponent down and even hit them when they were on the ground, tussle with them. But due to public complaints and for general safety reasons, boxing as a sport adopted the Queensberry rules in 1867, and they're largely in place today. Gloves for the participants, weight classes, a 3-minute round followed by a 1-minute rest. And if you're knocked down, you had 10 seconds to stand up or you lost. It's quite remarkable that hundreds of years later, those are pretty much the same rules that you see today. I'm going to take you a bit decade by decade, bringing up to the present to give you a little more background on combat sports and how the monetization works with pay-per-view, and maybe remind you a few things that happened in each of these decades that kind of sets the stage. So pay-per-view was a better mousetrap for monetizing these major events. So by the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, boxing, wrestling, some movies, sometimes a kickboxing bout would be the fare that you would find on pay-per-view. Now, in 1992, there was a new version of a pay-per-view event. It was the infamous Olympics triple cast, which was kind of derided at the time of like, oh, well, that wasn't so great. But it was very ambitious, and it grew into something that's still in use today. So it was a multi-day, multi-live stream pay-per-view event. You bought a whole package, and you would see all the Summer Olympics. This was Barcelona. It was later adopted by ESPN college package games on pay-per-view, and then later, NBA, NHL, and then of course DirecTV did a lot with it with the NFL Sunday Ticket out-of-market games, and so pay-per-view bundling became an option. Now, in this time period, late 80s, early 90s, lots of boxing stars, big names, bringing eyeballs and dollar signs. People like Mike Tyson, George Foreman, Julio Cesar Chavez, Macho Camacho, Evander Holyfield, and Roy Jones Jr. HBO and Showtime were the two big boxing kings, if you will, and they had their pay-per-view arms. They worked with promoters like Don King and Bob Arum. And of course, the biggest star of all was Iron Mike Tyson, the youngest ever heavyweight champ. Now, in 1992, Mike Tyson was accused and convicted of rape and was sent to prison. So there were many years in his prime where he was behind bars serving time in the 90s, but he did serve his time and he changed his life around. And, that was not that atypical for the boxing world. It always had a little bit of an edge to it, what with gambling involved and various promoters and judges, and sometimes people thinking that they didn't score and someone got robbed, or maybe someone threw a fight. But there was always a really dramatic appeal about boxing events as well. Now, in 1993, there was a new entrant to combat sports called the UFC. It was started by Bob Meyerowitz, who was from the music business, Campbell McLaren, David Isaacs, Art Davey, John Milius, the film director, and Rorion Gracie from Brazil, whose family brought a brand new sport to a much broader audience. It was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and it came to dominate most of the UFC early events, and sometimes still does. The UFC event initially was a free-for-all, a tough man style tournament where you're going to be fighting a couple of times in the same night if you're going to win it all. All fighting styles were welcome, all weight classes, and no rules. Well, 3 rules: no biting, eye gouging, or groin strikes. Fun fact, I won first place in the nationwide pay-per-view contest for UFC 1. I won $50. So in 94, DirecTV launched, Dish Network launched in 96. This was a good thing for consumers because now there was pay-per-view and, cable television options with usually better pricing because there was competition, and competition is always great for a market. This is when analog channels increased their bandwidth, became digital channels, and everyone was talking about the information superhighway. Like every trade show I would go to, that was the keynote speech. That meant 500 channels. Still nothing to watch, right? Broadband internet rolled out. Paging became a thing for about 10 minutes. But back to combat sports pay-per-view. So in 1996, the UFC got the attention of Senator John McCain, who called UFC human cockfighting, quote unquote. And he lobbied for all the governors to ban this awful sport, which they did So the UFC was stripped from carriage on any cable system. Also, Dish Network left it. Only DirecTV still hung on. All right, so the decade's continuing. Back on the boxing side in 1997, Mike Tyson bit Holyfield's ear live on pay-per-view in Las Vegas in their second dust-up. Fun fact, I was a guest of Showtime and was there and saw it live. So wrapping up the 90s, the internet became public in 91, but it really wasn't until the end of the decade that people started actively using emails for the first time and using floppy disks on their computers, if you remember that, and building websites, etc. So let's move on up forward into time to the aughts. So 2000, once we got over the Y2K debacle, which never happened, we find that cable TV has wired the entire country of the US, and satellite companies are dominant. This is how people are getting their news and their entertainment. And I'll talk a little bit about DirecTV, which got backing from the aerospace industry and Hughes. They had a lot of money, they did innovative things, and I was happy to be their head of pay-per-view for the first part of that decade. We did things on a big scale. We carried all the big boxing matches and wrestling. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, we were the sole UFC carrier. All right, fun fact, Dana White came to my office to thank us for their support, never abandoning them, and said, great news. This was 2001. He said, we've been bought by this group named Zuffa, and in 2002, we're going to relaunch. We've got rules. We've got weight classes. We're going to be sanctioned by Nevada State and any state that they have their events in. Now, the UFC was in the red for many, many years. It was very hard to hang on when you can't sell live gate tickets and cable's not carrying you. But they did something very innovative and smart in 2005. They did the Ultimate Fighter TV show. Now, they put it on the cable network named Spike, which would not give them a licensing deal. They had to barter, they had to buy the time, but they believed in themselves. In fact, they couldn't really sell much advertising, so they just promoted themselves and their fighters and their brand. And turns out that's a pretty smart idea. Basically, they took a page from the WWE playbook, which is to give a bunch of content for free, or at least on cable for free, to the largest possible audience. You build up the storyline and your fighters, and you build the story arc, and you've got the big competitors coming up, the denouement. That's what you put on pay-per-view. So got to give props to the UFC. They had a mission and they believed in themselves, and you will find that's a common refrain for a lot of companies that were starting out in the early aughts. Most of them are the biggest ones out there 20, 30 years later. So, but in the middle of the 2000s, paging's now out, mobile's in. Amazon sells books, but then they decided to branch out just a little bit. iTunes launches in 2001, so that completely upends and changes the music industry. MySpace, remember that, launches in 2003, then Facebook in 2004, though it started with the Facebook, and then YouTube in 2005. Netflix and Roku, which were the same company kind of at the inception, they branch off in separate directions. And Netflix changed its name for their streaming service, and they lost half their value temporarily. Streaming, what's streaming? We'll get to that later. Netflix tried to get Blockbuster Video to buy them. Blockbuster was the king of the heap, the 800-pound gorilla. They had 45,000 or 4,500 stores coast to coast. But they were kind of laughed out of the offices. They had no interest in buying Netflix. So that helped Reed Hastings and the early Netflix folks to have a mission themselves. They were going to believe in themselves, and they were going to make Blockbuster pay for that. So look who's laughing now. Boxing also had a great decade. Stars like Mike Tyson, Lennox Lewis, Oscar De La Hoya, Shane Mosley, Manny Pacquiao, and of course, money, Floyd Mayweather Jr. And more on him later too. All right, so we're moving on to our decades of 2010. Now, in this decade, everyone has an email, everyone has a smartphone, you might have a smart TV, and companies all had websites. So it was inevitable that cable companies and networks would all start going online. It was the decade of the VMVPD. Fun fact, I was chief content officer at Filmon, which was one of the early MVPDs. And we offered on a global basis streaming broadcast channels, cable channels, new diginets, and pay-per-view on a global basis. We met with the FCC, yeah, that one in DC, and they too felt we were moving in the right direction for consumers. So we were a little ahead of the curve. So there was a lot of stuff in the news about it, little litigation, everything was settled eventually. It's kind of hard to be on the bleeding edge sometimes, but basically we kind of set the standard of what you see now in Pluto and Zumo and a lot of others. And frankly, most cable companies and networks, what with the Peacock and the various stacked, HBO Max, people are consolidating and doing everything on a streaming basis. Another thing that changed the face of combat sports was literally a change in gender. Ronda Rousey made her debut on UFC in 2011, forever opening the doors for all sorts of female athletes today. And she also became their biggest star. Conor McGregor became a mega star with his debut in 2013, and they realized that the big stars sell big. In 2016, UFC sells to Endeavor for $4.4 billion. So MMA no longer a niche sport. Conor McGregor did something very interesting halfway through that decade. In 2015, he agreed to fight Mayweather. So it was boxing versus MMA, using boxing rules. Well, boxing ultimately won the night, but everybody involved got bigger and stronger and wealthier because the event made about $500 million. They discovered a new hook. You can combine audiences, and 1 + 1 can equal 3. There are other big boxers in the decade. The Klitschko brothers come to mind, but one of the biggest ones, superstars to come out of that era was Canelo Alvarez and maybe GGG. Now, what happens often at the end of a decade portends what's coming up for the next 10 years. So what happened in 2018 in November was 2 YouTubers decided, they weren't boxers, they were YouTubers. They decided to fight themselves in the UK on YouTube. And this was KSI and Logan Paul. And they didn't use any traditional pay-per-view carriers and did huge business. So the following year, in 2019, DAZN, Sky, and a little entity named Fight carried KSI Paul 2, and it was a mega streaming event. And you could kind of start seeing now the writing was on the walls. Things are about to change just a little bit. So let's talk about 2020 and beyond. All right, 2020, global pandemic, the world changes. Sports, live sports, gone, at least ceased. We've entered the present, so I don't need to say a whole lot about the last year that was. Life changed forevermore, and I don't think it's quite done with us. So many changes happened, and you could see a lot of the changes from state to state, to new laws, a new president, new societal changes, both good and bad, more AI. Social media becomes like the new TV stations. From a combat sports perspective, UFC goes all in on streaming pay-per-view, leaving cable and satellite. They also came up with an innovative thing with the Fight Island and putting athletes in a bubble, and a lot of sports followed after that. And props to pro wrestling. They never really stopped during the pandemic, and they started doing live events in huge arenas with no audiences. So people picked up on that too. And then also the 90s combat stars returned for big bucks. Tyson-Jones Jr. was the biggest pay-per-view event of 2020 and the 8th biggest of all time. On that undercard was Jake Paul, and he harnessed his 40 million plus social followers and fought in April of this year against MMA's Ben Askren, delivering a first round KO. Then every fighter started calling, I want to fight Jake Paul. I want to fight him. Well, he is scheduled to fight another MMA fighter, Tyron Woodley, in July of this year. And this month, Jake's brother Logan fought Floyd Mayweather in an exhibition match. And last weekend, MMA's Anderson Silva beat Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. in a boxing match from Mexico. So the stars of combat sports are starting to mix it up for everybody. So what's next? Well, in a world where more things are becoming automated and AI driven, I believe that combat sports will become even more popular. In fact, you're probably going to see robots fighting each other too, but I think the human element will always prevail and always be of interest. I think you'll see more celebrity driven combat sports because people with an audience will attract pay-per-view buyers. And contrary to what a lot of some people say, that they complain about celebrity sports saying, oh, it kind of is a black mark on, the sweet science of boxing. It's hurting it. I really have to disagree. It actually shows more people just how good the real athletes are. And it serves to bring in new audiences, which is always important for sports or anything you market. You gotta always be building that farm team. Anyway, I'd like to thank you for spending time with me today. If you have any questions or wish to partner up with FITE on a partnership, or you have an event, feel free to send me an email, Kim@FITE.tv. That's Kim@FITE.tv. Thank you. I appreciate you.
Kim, thank you so much. I've got a very quick question for you, transition, and what do you see happening in the next 5 years, really quickly, in the next 30 seconds?
Well, I think that you will see a wider variety of pay-per-view. You won't always see like a 3-hour event. I think you're going to see micro transactions. I think that, a lot of Gen Z and millennial audiences like things that are shorter, and they're willing to pay, but maybe pay a little less, but just give me some of the knockouts, like just the highlights, the good stuff. I think some things that have been said by other people today, that esports and gaming will become more and more prevalent through other sports and other presentations, and even movies and long form. And so you'll see a gamification with more interactivity where people get involved, like a game, although it doesn't have to be a typical game.
Sure. Kim, thank you so much for taking time today. It's a great walk through the different decades, and as you kind of led us through that.